Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Timing is Key for Planning Your Driving Retirement. I'm Mary McGuire, Director of Public and Government Affairs at AAA Northeast. Thank you for joining us to discuss an issue that many of us, if we are fortunate, will eventually face. When is it time to give up driving? We know from our AAA Foundation for Traffic Safety research that when you look at the numbers, older drivers are generally competent, conscientious, careful, and safe drivers until their skills begin declining. When that happens, many older drivers decide to give up driving voluntarily. But for others, leaving driving in the rearview mirror can be an agonizing and difficult decision for them and for their caregivers and loved ones who worry about everything from social isolation to the practical concerns of getting that older former driver to the doctor, the grocery store, and more. Research tells us that the average older driver outlives his or her ability to drive safely 6 to 10 years. My own father and my mother-in-law offered me a study in contrast. My father was still driving well in his early 80s, but just a few years later, I began noticing changes in his driving behavior. My dad lived outside Washington, D.C., where I grew up, and one day we were driving on the Capitol Beltway, one of the busiest highways in the country, when my dad realized he'd missed his exit. Without any hesitation or warning, he stopped abruptly in the right lane, threw the car into reverse, and began backing up on the Beltway to get back to the exit. Needless to say, once we were safely off the road and I'd recovered my composure, I permanently took over driving my dad. But it was not easy for him as someone who had always been the driver in the family. It was part of his identity, really. On the other hand, my mother-in-law, now 90 years old and always one to think ahead, planned her retirement from driving when she noticed that her neuropathy made it difficult for her to feel the accelerator. When she moved into an independent living center at age 85, she quietly gave up her car and her keys, declaring that the time was right. From a safety and sanity standpoint, I can tell you that my mother-in-law's approach was far easier and less stressful for us, for family to handle. But this is not always a smooth process, as you'll learn today. And that is why AAA Northeast has developed a new website, online workshop, and toolkit called Key Timing, designed to help older drivers and their caregivers plan for driving retirement. We have a great lineup of speakers who will offer advice for navigating driving retirement today, demonstrate how key timing works, and talk about transportation options in Massachusetts. Joanna Forgiorgia is a traffic safety and public affairs specialist at AAA Northeast who regularly interacts with older drivers. A former driving instructor, Joanna is here to tour these online key timing resources with us today. Michelle Alex is the Community Outreach Coordinator for the Massachusetts Registry of Motor Vehicles and has spent the last 2 decades providing safe driving and licensing workshops on behalf of the RMV. She is an expert on both senior and teen driving and has spent countless hours working with older drivers. Rachel Fichtenbaum is the Executive Office of Health and Human Services Mobility Manager at Mass Mobility. She has been with Mass Mobility since 2011 and enjoys working with organizations across Massachusetts to identify and implement best practices and innovative strategies to help older adults, people with disabilities, and others improve their access and mobility. And finally, we'll cap off our presentation with a short video on driver evaluations from Amy Donabedian, a certified driving rehabilitation specialist and occupational therapist at Spalding Rehab Hospital. Welcome to all of you, welcome to our audience, and thanks so much for being with us today. This webinar is being recorded, and I invite all members of our audience to type any questions you may have into the chat during the broadcast, and I will pose those questions to our speakers. So don't be shy, type your questions into the chat, and you may have to click on that little red arrow to do that. So Joanna, thanks for being with us, and let's begin with you. How pressing is this issue for families, and tell us about key timing and how people can best use this resource.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, Mary. And I'm just going to share a few statistics that I think are incredibly relevant and realize why this issue is so important. So we know from a healthy aging data report that the predictions say in the United States by 2030, roughly 72 million adults, which is 1 out of every 5 people, will be 65 or older. And this is reflected in Massachusetts as well. About 15% of the state's population is currently over the age of 65. That's more than 125,000 people, and more than the last 3 years. So we know that we have a growing older population. And there's also another prediction that by 2035, over 30% of the population will be over the age of 60 in virtually every municipality in Massachusetts. So I definitely think that this discussion on senior mobility and driving retirement is really apt. And I can attest, and I'm sure Mary can as well, that at AAA, we field quite a few concerns from our members and even from our communities about this issue. So sometimes I would receive calls from older adults that were struggling with finding a driving evaluation or just with other physical challenges that driving presented. But also we would field calls from members who were concerned about an older adult loved one who they believed was reaching driving retirement. So 6 years ago, AAA really wanted to kind of invest in this issue, and they created an online resource called Key Timing to provide caregivers with valuable information and tips for starting that difficult and sometimes awkward conversation with seniors about driving retirement. And this is a resource that we recently updated. And so we did this by adding a really engaging e-learning module. So if you go to AAA.com/key timing, that will be one of the first things that should catch your eye. And this was created by our staff as well as AAA's Learning and Development Department. Specifically, I want to give a shout out to our amazing staff, Alicia Williamson, who is an award-winning Learning and Development staff member. So this is kind of the e-learning module. It's broken up. It's really easy, really accessible for anybody who's looking. But then also on that website, and really what I'm going to go over today is the Senior Mobility Planning Toolkit. So this toolkit has 4 different parts, and we'll kind of tour this as we go along. So the first section encourages caregivers to do their research about the challenges that older adult drivers face. So for example, in this section, there are spaces to list any health challenges that an older driver might be experiencing. We know as people age, there can be issues physically that pop up that can have an impact on driving. Then also noting prescriptions. And this section as well, there's that opportunity to write down potential side effects that could be impacting an older driver's driving abilities. And then also the financial concerns related to different transportation options. Finances are one of the biggest things when we're talking about this issue that seniors are really concerned about is, can I afford driving retirement? And so there's a space in this document to go over that. And then also the second section is really that preparation for having a respectful conversation with an older adult who is facing driving retirement, or maybe who should be addressing this issue. So this section goes over potential sources of stress for that older adult. So think things that are the elephant in the room. That could be previous crashes, health concerns, or maybe traffic violations. These can all be, again, the elephant in the room that needs to be addressed, but it needs to be done so nicely, gently. And so in this section, we actually provide some negotiation strategies and tips, such as choosing a specific time of day where that loved one might be more apt to listen and engage. And then also there's one feature that I really enjoy personally is a role-playing activity with applicable scenarios. I know I'm a big one for practicing difficult conversations before I need to do them. So I think that's really helpful and can be a powerful tool as you prepare for a conversation as a caregiver might approach an older loved one. And then the third part is really assessing that older adult's driving ability and discussing potential modifications. So in this section, there are kind of some state resources that are noted, but then also there might be changes that should be discussed with that older driver. So thinking about discussing how periphery vision can really be fading as a person ages, or neck mobility, agility and flexibility. Those are all issues that might seem kind of small, but they can actually have a huge impact on somebody's driving. And then also we might, in this section, we encourage people to maybe take a refresher course. So we actually have a driver improvement program at AAA that does courses. They're online right now, but that could be a great resource or refresher for somebody. And then also this section goes over smart features that can really, really assist with certain things. So if a senior is having issues with neck mobility, things like blind spot detection could be a huge resource, or that backup camera. Those types of things for seniors can be a real game changer in helping them drive more safely and kind of extending their driving life. And then also there's tips about car maintenance and exercises that can help with longevity over time. And then in the fourth and last section, it's putting that plan into action. So really this section encourages trying out mobility resources and discuss, after that discussion, put that plan into action. And so actually in this section, it refers to some of the following panelists, their organization. So they're going to expand on this more, but we really hope this tool is practical and useful for any caregiver out there who's thinking about driving retirement.
So Joanna, I'm struck by a couple of things you said, and thank you for that great tour of key timing and all of those resources. And you're absolutely right. We're going to hear a lot more about transportation resources and alternatives from Rachel and from Michelle. But one of the things I hadn't considered is the financial stressors that you're talking about. How do I pay for the kind of transportation that I'm going to be needing? And so it's great that you have that component there in key timing. How often do you hear this kind of concern from some of the older drivers and their caregivers with whom you work?
I think fairly regularly, because I really do feel like that financial concern, it is real and it does affect seniors, and the ability to plan for something like that does take a lot of effort and thought, and then discussions with potentially that that older adults, loved ones, their caregivers. There kind of needs to be that give and take of saying, okay, well, how can I help you out with this? Or how can I help you, find these resources? Because I think that can sometimes be the issue. In addition to finances, it's figuring out the costs. Even that can be difficult for an older adult, where some of those costs might not be upfront available for somebody who's planning for driving retirement.
And that's where working together with a team of caregivers, hopefully, people who care about you, can make a difference. I'm sure. I'm also glad that you mentioned the driver improvement program, because that refresher course that AAA offers can certainly be a real boost to all of us. We all need a refresher course in driving, really. So I think that that's something that people can also take advantage of. So Joanna, thank you so much for that great tour. Michelle, you have been working with seniors for many years now. From your long experience, how common is this issue of driving retirement or giving up driving among families? And I know the RMV offers a lot of great resources to families and to caregivers. So can you tell us about those?
Oh, sure. Thank you so much, Mary, for inviting the registry to be with you today. And congrats to AAA on this wonderful resource. We're so excited about key timing. So, Mary, we've worked together for many years, and it's odd that we don't plan as a society. We really don't plan for driving retirement. We plan for our vacations and our retirement from our careers and, all sorts of things. But none of us really plans for the day that we'll have to stop driving. So to have resources like this is just so helpful. So we'll take a quick look. I've got a quick presentation, and we'll take a quick look at older drivers. And I want everyone to know, first of all, thank you all for joining us today. And I want you to know that the registry is here to help you and to be a resource. And all of my contact information is available on this PowerPoint. And a shout out to Mark as well, who's behind the scenes taking care of our technical today. And Mark has provided our PowerPoint presentations for all of you. So a quick look at older drivers, and as Mary and Joanna both mentioned, that older drivers as a group have a safe, have a relatively low crash rate. And that is because they regulate their driving. They tend to put self-imposed limits on their own driving, and that really does help to keep them safe for many years. Here are a few ways that older adults tend to regulate their driving. Maybe they avoid driving at night or stick to familiar roads, and pre-pandemic, maybe they were scheduling their trips after rush hour or before the commute home. So, there are certain times of the day they might have had the luxury to go out a little bit later when the traffic was not so heavy. And I want to really bring your attention to a study that was released by the Insurance Institute of Highway Safety. IIHS issued a study that was so encouraging about older drivers and the crash rate. So I really want you to know that up until age 75, the crash rate is relatively low. Next. However, the crash rate, unfortunately, doesn't stay low forever. And as both Mary and Joanna mentioned, that there is cause for concern for the older among us, the older drivers. In fact, around the age of 75, the crash rate does begin to increase for drivers. And then in our 80s, the crash rate is even more markedly increased. So and at the same time, keep in mind, while that crash rate is increasing, the number of miles being driven tends to decrease. So when we look at the crash data and we see the number of crashes per mile driven, there is cause for concern for our older adults. And on top of that, the fatality rate for our drivers 80 and older is higher, the highest among all age group drivers. So it's really important that you're here with us today to learn about what the reasons are for this increase in crash and how to help your older driver. Next slide. So let's look at the culprits. What's happening? And I'll take a quick look at this. But, as we grow up, and I hate to call it getting old, as we grow up, our bodies are changing. And some of those changes are wonderful, and some of those changes might wreak havoc on our driving. And as Joanna mentioned, vision, reaction time, cognitive ability, hearing. Joanna also mentioned strength, flexibility, range of motion, and agility. All of those, unfortunately, tend to decline with age, and that's the bad news. That's the bad news. And if they go unchecked, then they absolutely will negatively impact our driving. When you think about driving, I want you to understand how extremely complex driving is as a skill. And know that within 1 mile of driving, the driver makes approximately 25 different decisions. So that tells you the driver is making these rapid fire decisions while operating heavy machinery, right? A car is, it's extremely complex skill to drive safely. So next slide. So put on top of the changes in our physical and cognitive ability, we also really need to be mindful of medications. Many medications have side effects that can impact our driving. Know that here in Massachusetts, be aware that the operating under the influence law, OUI, includes prescription medication, over-the-counter medication, in addition to, of course, alcohol and illegal drugs. But I was surprised to learn that the Benadryl that I might take for my allergies really might impact my ability to drive safely. So again, AAA's got this great RX program that you can look up any medication and see what are the effects of that medication, what are the side effects, and know that medications can cause collisions. Next slide. So on our website at the Registry of Motor Vehicles, we have a really comprehensive checklist and it lists all the warning signs of unsafe driving. And these are just a few of the things to look out for. I won't go through the entire list today, but if you are seeing red flags, such as having difficulty keeping up with the posted speed limit, having difficulty seeing clearly at night, getting lost on one's familiar roads, all red flags and all indicators that there might be an issue with the person's ability to operate safely. Next slide, please. So what's your plan? And the registry provides virtual programs. Prior to the pandemic, we were out 5 days a week and sometimes on the weekends presenting safe driving programs. And the question we always want to ask is, what is your driving retirement plan? What is your plan? You know, we're sitting here and you're attending today because you're concerned about a driver, but you also need to be mindful of your own plan. Use these tools and this advice to help you figure out your driving retirement plan. So, and Mary mentioned women will outlive their ability to drive safely by 10 years, and men tend to outlive their ability to drive safely by 7 years. So now is the time to plan before a crisis. Next slide, please. So how to identify that plan? Well, key timing, as we said, is a great resource. Also, ask yourself, where have you driven recently, and how would you get there if you didn't drive? Make a list of the locations that you need to get to, whether it's the store, whether it's to visit family, and understand that you need to have a plan in place to get there without driving. Do your research before you speak to an older driver about their driving ability. Know what's available in the community. Mass Mobility has great resources on their website and a monthly newsletter that I encourage all of you, if you're providers, to subscribe to. AAA has absolute great resources, and please plan ahead because your mobility can change even temporarily. Next slide, please, Mark. So if you're worried about someone's driving, and Joanna really touched upon this, but think about who is going to have that conversation. The conversation might be needed by a few people in that person's circle. You know, maybe it's the family member that will have the conversation, but it also might be the person's physician or the person, if they have a financial advisor, you know, and if they're reluctant to give up the keys, look at it from a financial standpoint. Understand that it might take more than one person to convince an older adult or any driver to give up the keys. So, and when to have that conversation, obviously before crisis, and as Joanna mentioned, in a neutral, non-biased location. Some families maybe you've ridden with an older driver and you've seen something that made you very nervous. Maybe they pulled out into traffic when it wasn't safe to do so. Well, let's not have that driving retirement conversation while the person's driving and while you're in the car with them. That can be a very stressful situation. So again, wait, compose yourself, take notes on what you're observing, and then have a respectful and understanding conversation with that older adult, and provide options. And here's a list of just some of the options that are available. Next slide, please, Mark. So who can help? The Registry of Motor Vehicles, Medical Affairs Bureau, and I'll get to what we can do for you. Of course, councils on aging are very, very helpful. Police departments might have something called triads, and that is where an officer works with the seniors in the community. Of course, healthcare providers, OTs, PTs, occupational therapists, physical therapists, as I mentioned, financial advisors, attorneys, members in the community, and you might be surprised at this last one, repair techs. I can't tell you, over the past 2 decades of doing this work, sometimes I've heard success stories from families who have convinced the older adult that the car does need to be serviced. The car goes into the repair shop, and the family notifies the repair technician that they are really struggling with trying to get the keys away. So sometimes the repair tech will keep the car in the shop for that family. And you know, it seems tricky, but sometimes we have to think outside the box when it comes to keeping your loved ones safe and to keeping the public safe as well. So next slide, please. So in situations where you need to take immediate action, know that you can file with the Registry of Motor Vehicles a request for a medical evaluation. So, and I get this question almost weekly, how do I report someone to the registry? I'm worried they're not listening to me. I can't get the keys away. What do I do? This is what you do. This request for medical evaluation form gets the ball rolling. There is a link to it on my PowerPoint. We also have it on our website. But that is the form that you would fill out, and that notifies the registry that, hey, there might be a potential problem here. The registry will write a letter to the driver in question, and the registry will include an evaluation form for the driver to take to their healthcare provider. And the healthcare provider will fill out that form, and the driver is responsible for returning that completed form to the registry. The registry will take action based on what their healthcare provider recommends. So know that that is a very powerful tool in your wallet, on your computer and at your disposal to use. Medical Affairs Bureau, the fax number, you can just fax that form right into Medical Affairs. Keep in mind, in Massachusetts, there is no confidentiality. So when you file a report to the registry, you do have to include your name and contact information. Okay, next slide, please, Mark. So keep in mind, driving is a privilege. None of us has the right to drive. It's a privilege, and it comes with a great deal of responsibility. If your loved one is arguing with you that my driver's license is my only form of identification, you can tell them, no, it's not. The Registry of Motor Vehicles also issues Massachusetts ID cards. And in fact, if a person voluntarily surrenders their driver's license, while there is time still left on that license, they can surrender their license through the mail, through Medical Affairs, and be issued a free Massachusetts ID card. So keep that in mind too. So if you're having a discussion with your loved one about giving up the keys and they're worried about a lack of identification, we can help. We can help and provide them with a Massachusetts ID card. Next slide, Mark. Now, these are the resources that I've mentioned already. We have links to everything that I'm talking about today. Next slide, please. Oh, a little bit of housekeeping for those of you that maybe have not heard. Senior hours at the registry are every Wednesday because in Massachusetts, the law requires in-person driver's license renewals for people 75 or older. So they must come into the registry if you're 75 or older in order to renew your driver's license. So we do have senior hours dedicated to our customers starting on April 1st. This is great timing for this presentation, but starting on April 1st, we're opening up our senior hours to age 65 plus. So we're inviting our younger customers to come on in on Wednesday mornings if they're 65 and older, and they have to take care of in-person transactions. You can call our dedicated phone number to make an appointment, which is 857-368-8005, or my email is there. You can just send me an email and I'll help you out and make an appointment, or you can make that appointment on your own on our website. Next slide. If you're worried about the Real ID, know that both AAA as well as the registry can issue the Real ID. We're encouraging people during the pandemic, though, to not come in just for the Real ID. We're offering an incentive. If you hold a driver's license, you can renew your driver's license online as a standard. And then once the state of emergency ends, you can come on in and we will upgrade your standard driver's license free of charge. Now that is specific to the Registry of Motor Vehicles. I don't think AAA is doing that, because AAA is absolutely issuing Real IDs for any member who is interested. But we at the registry, we're trying to limit the number of people coming in person during the pandemic. So that's our little incentive. Renew, if you can, your license online. And then once the pandemic ends, state of emergency is lifted, come on in and we'll upgrade you for free. Thanks, Mark. Next slide. If you'd like to request a workshop, I'm here to help you. I'd be happy to do one. My contact information is there. And next slide. We also have contact information from medical affairs, and they are just a great source of information. There's their direct phone number, as well as their fax and email. Next slide, please. Lastly, I'd like to thank you all for your attention and really for your participation. And I also encourage you to not only go to our website, but follow us on Twitter as well. So thank you very much and stay safe.
Hey, thank you so much, Michelle. Great presentation with so much good information. I'm excited about those new senior visitor hours. I think those will really be an asset for people who have questions. So that's just terrific. And I've got to return your shout out to AAA by saying that you have been such a great partner over the years. You and I have co-presented on many presentations together. You've done it with many other members of our staff, and you and your colleagues at the RMV have really been terrific partners for us. So we certainly appreciate all of that information that you've shared with us. Quick question before we move on to Rachel and all of the great information that she has for us about transportation options and alternatives. You talked about Roadwise RX, the AAA tool, which I'm so glad you did. And Mark, maybe you can put up that slide with the Roadwise RX site address on it. But how often do you find in your experience that the prescriptions that an older driver may be taking will have an impact on driving ability?
That's a great question, Mary, and it is concerning, because the statistics tell us that it's anyone 65 and older is probably taking at least one prescription, if not more than one prescription, and so we don't consider as I said, the over-counter meds, the prescription meds. If the doctor is telling me to take this medication, well, it's going to be fine for me and it shouldn't impact me in any way. So people have to understand that just because you're being prescribed a medication, have that very important conversation with the doctor. How will this affect my driving? Will this impact my driving? And also pay very close attention to the first 2 days where you are taking that medication, because that's when any side effects will appear, Mary. So the first couple of days of taking that medication, people should really pay attention to, how are you feeling? Are you feeling drowsy? Do you feel lightheaded? Are you queasy? Those are all side effects that really can impact our driving. So it's so important that we pay attention to this medication. And I love the Roadwise RX. I've used it myself when people have asked me, well, will my arthritis medicine or my high blood pressure medicine affect my driving? I'll say, well, let's go online and check out to see what the side effects. Everyone's body chemistry is different. So what affects you might not affect someone else. So keep that in mind too. It is a case by case. And you are the captain of your ship, right? you need to know that in Massachusetts, all the responsibility and liability falls on the license holder to make sure that they are safe to operate.
Yeah, so much great advice. And to your point, if you visit the Roadwise RX site, you can simply plug in the prescriptions that you're taking, and you'll get an assessment of what kind of an impact those medications could have on your driving. So really a terrific tool for everybody in our audience today to try out. So Rachel, let's move on to you. Thank you, Michelle, so much. Rachel, you're an expert on mobility in Massachusetts, including senior mobility and options for people with disabilities. Tell us about the transportation options and alternatives that are available.
Great. Thank you so much to AAA for inviting me today, and to everyone for attending, and to Michelle and Joanna for the great presentations. So I'm Rachel Fichtenbaum with Mass Mobility. Mass Mobility is a statewide initiative. We're based in the Executive Office of Health and Human Services, and our mission is to increase mobility for older adults, people with disabilities, anyone who lacks access to transportation. So we do that in two main ways. One is by sharing information about what options are out there in communities across Massachusetts, like I'm going to talk a little bit about today. And the other is by helping organizations think about what they could do to implement some new mobility options or expand mobility in their region to fill in some of the gaps. Next slide, please. So we take a community transportation approach to everything we do, which means we're not just focused on the bus or the train or transportation that's funded in a specific way. We're interested in anything that's out there that might be available in your community to help you get where you want to go. Next slide, please. So what is available? Well, in Massachusetts, it really varies. Transportation options vary from one region to the next, and even from one town to the next. So what's going to be available for you to help you get where you want to go? It's really going to depend on where you are and also on where you're going. Next, please. Thank you. So no matter where you are, a great place to start in Massachusetts is Ride Match, which you can find online at www.massridematch.org. And like Michelle said, Mark actually set it up so you can download our PowerPoints directly from this webinar on the side panel. So you don't have to worry about writing all these links down. If you're interested in them, you can just download them. So Ride Match is an online searchable database of public and private transportation options in Massachusetts. And you can search it in two different ways. So you can either go to the top and there's a drop-down menu and you can select your city or town, and then you'll get a list of the different public and private transportation options available in your town. Or you can use the trip planner. So for the trip planner, you would put in where you're starting, where you want to go. If you want, you can check off some common accommodations you might need, like if you're traveling with a wheelchair, and then hit go. And next slide, please. Then you'll get a list of the public and private transportation options that can do that trip, that go from A to B. And GATRA, which is one of the transit authorities in Massachusetts, they're the ones who created Ride Match. They wanted the cheaper options to show up first because of those affordability issues that Joanna, you were talking about. So first you're going to get public transit options, then you'll get subsidized options like a Council on Aging van or a volunteer driver program. And then next slide, please. At the end, you'll get taxi and livery companies. And for each option, you'll get a phone number, you get a link to more information, including a website, so you can check out these different options, look and see what might be a good option for you, and call them to ask any questions you have or to find out how you can reserve a trip or book a trip. And I know, this may come up in the questions, but sometimes people these days are wondering about safety during the pandemic of taking any particular option. And certainly transportation providers have learned a lot over the course of the pandemic, and the CDC has put out some great information that transportation providers are following about providing safe trips. But anytime, if you have those specific questions, if you're worried about something, you can always ask your transportation provider directly to what are their safety protocols so that you'll feel more comfortable about taking that trip. Next slide, please. So Ride Match is one strategy for getting started, finding out what's available in your community for transportation options. Another strategy is to get to know key partners. Michelle mentioned some of these key partners, but in terms of key partners, I would start with your transit authority, your council on aging, and your aging service access point, or ASAP. And these links will take you to places where you can find contact information for these key partners that serve your region or your town. Next slide, please. So I'll start with transit authorities. The MBTA is the biggest transit authority in Massachusetts, serving Greater Boston, but there are also 15 regional transit authorities serving different regions around the state. And most, but not all towns are members of a transit authority. And this webpage, which is Public Transportation in Massachusetts on the mass.gov site, that'll give you a list of each transit authority and the different towns it serves, so you can figure out which transit authority serves your region. Even within a transit authority's service area, though, not every town that's a member gets the same services. It still depends a lot on what town you're in, where you're starting from, and where you're going. Next slide, please. And transit authorities actually offer a whole bunch of different types of services. When you think about public transit, you may think about a bus or a subway. And so that's one kind of service that transit authorities provide. We call that fixed route, because the route is fixed. It doesn't really change. You know which roads the bus is going to go on. There's a schedule, so you know approximately when you can get that bus. One of Michelle's slides mentioned travel trainers. If you're interested in possibly riding a bus or subway, but you have some questions or concerns, maybe it's been many years since you last rode a bus, you can see if your transit authority has a travel trainer, which is a professional whose job is to help you learn how to ride public transit safely and independently. So for example, you might be able to practice boarding the bus and paying your fare before, while the bus is out of service, before you have to do it in real time to feel more comfortable. In addition to the fixed route, transit authorities also offer more flexible services. So that includes paratransit, which is also called dial-a-ride or demand response. That's a flexible service. It's for people who are eligible. They sign up and apply, and if you get approved, then you can call a day or two in advance at least and reserve a trip. And as long as you're in the service area and traveling to somewhere in the service area, the vehicle comes to you and takes you where you're going. If that's something you might be interested in, I recommend checking and seeing what the eligibility process is in your area and who's eligible. It's not necessarily just based on age, it's often based on disability or whether you're able to ride the fixed route. And so that's something you're going to want to look into. And I would start early so that you're eligible and all set up by the time you want to take a trip. Transit authorities also offer some specialized services. So for example, a number of the regional transit authorities in Eastern Massachusetts offer long distance medical shuttles into Boston. So that could be a great option if you have a specialty appointment in Boston. You don't have to find a friend or family member to drive you all the way into the city. You can get a ride from the shuttle from closer to home. If that's something you're interested in, check out the schedule so that you can make sure to book your appointment on a day when you can take that shuttle and in the time period when you'll be able to get the ride back home as well. And then microtransit. Microtransit is kind of the hot new thing in the transportation industry right now. It is on-demand rides provided by transit authorities. So on-demand means it's kind of like Uber or Lyft. You don't have to reserve it in advance and the vehicle comes to you. But the difference between Uber and Lyft and microtransit is a public transit service. So the driver is a public transit driver who's gone through training on working with older adults or people with disabilities, and they have more access to wheelchair accessible vehicles. This is something that a number of transit authorities are experimenting with right now. So again, you can find your transit authority, visit their website or give them a call and find out what different services they may offer in your region. Next slide, please. So transit authorities, that was one of the key partners. And the other key partners I mentioned were councils on aging and aging service access points. So different types of transportation services that they may offer. A number of councils on aging offer a van going to key destinations in town or in nearby towns. Some also subsidize services. So they may subsidize taxi or Uber or Lyft trips to help make some of those options more affordable. And some also operate volunteer driver programs where they recruit people, community members who have some spare time, who want to help out, and match them to older adults or others who need rides. And then aging service access points, they may also offer some transportation programs like these. And both ASAPs and COAs, they tend to be knowledgeable about what transportation options are out there. And so even if you're not sure that they offer a service, a transportation option that you want to try, I still recommend getting to know them and reaching out to them because they can be very helpful in helping you think through the different options and get connected to what's going to work well for you. Next slide, please. So, I mentioned that Mass Mobility, we do two things. We share information about what's out there. We also help organizations think about what they can do to expand the transportation network and fill in some of the gaps. And so if you're looking for transportation options and you find that there's one destination that you're just not finding an option that is exactly what you want, going to take you exactly where you want to go at the right time, there are options for getting involved. If this is something you're excited about or care about, Mass Mobility has some resources. So if you're a rider or a family member and you're interested in getting involved, you can check out our webpage on getting involved in transportation planning processes for some suggestions and resources and groups. The picture here is of some older adults who were frequent attendees at a senior center in Boston. And the road right outside their senior center was a really busy road. And so they got together and they advocated for some safer roadway features so that they would feel safer crossing the street to get to and from the senior center. If you are a staff of an aging and disability service organization, you can check out our Human Service Agencies and Community Transportation webpage for information about different types of programming that agencies can implement, or examples of how agencies have collaborated together to fill in some of these gaps, or a list of funding resources so that if you have an idea, you can go for a grant to hopefully get you some funds to help pilot that. And the picture here is of the Quabog Connector, which is a transportation service serving about 9 towns in the Ware area, about halfway between Worcester and Springfield. That was an area with little to no transportation options, and some nonprofits, the town, the Council on Aging, the local hospital, and other community partners, they all got together and they realized that that lack of transportation, that was a big barrier to all the people they were trying to serve. And so they collaborated and they fundraised, and they were actually able to launch a transportation service that serves older adults and the general public in those 9 towns. And so that's an example of how organizations can get together and address some of the gaps that are out there. And next slide, please. So on that note, I will wrap it up, and I look forward to your questions. And as Michelle mentioned, I do put out a monthly newsletter, which is what's new, what's happening in community transportation around Massachusetts. So definitely, if this is a topic you're interested in, welcome you to sign up, and thank you all so much.
Rachel, thank you so much. So much great information, and I'm looking forward to getting your newsletter. So that's another great resource that I wasn't aware of. And I did go on Ride Match in preparation for this event, and so easy to navigate, really very, very easy to use, which was terrific. So thanks again for all of that great information. So we do have some audience questions. We want to get to those, but finally we have a very short video from Amy Donabedian at Spalding Rehabilitation Hospital. Amy outlined some of the key features of a driver evaluation, which is something we get questions on at AAA. I know you get questions about driver evals at the RMV and at Mass Mobility. And the evaluation is designed to assess an individual's cognitive and physical limitations related to safely operating a vehicle. Here's Amy.
So at Spalding Rehab Hospital in Charlestown, it's a 2-part comprehensive evaluation process. The first part is a pre-driving assessment where we spend 2 hours doing an intake with the patient. So that's patient interview style. We look at vision, perception, cognition, basic understanding of the rules of the road, their physical abilities, such as range of motion, strength, coordination, sensation, break reaction time on a computer, and visual processing speed, which is also computer-based. So some of our tasks are paper pencil, some are interview style, some are on the computer. Whatever limitations a person presents with, we can work around and sort of find a way to make it work for them. I think the main comparison is that the RMV focuses more on the maneuvers that are involved, the same testing that's involved when you get your license as a teenager. So backing up in a straight line, 3-point turns, parallel park. Our testing looks at your ability to operate the vehicle. So gas, brake, and steering. Are you in control of the vehicle? Your awareness and interaction with the environment. So stop signs mean stop. So if we start back at the pre-driving assessment, the clinical piece, if somebody does well, we would then schedule them to move on to an on-the-road test. Sometimes those people need more therapy before they're ready. We may suggest physical therapy, occupational therapy. Sometimes we suggest, because of a visual deficit, we need more information. Do they need to see a neuro-ophthalmologist? Is there a field cut? So sometimes it's a referral back to a medical specialist that can help us figure out what's the next step for the patient. Another suggestion or recommendation would be that they did not pass the clinical and that they need to retire from driving. And then there's a lengthy discussion about alternate means of transportation. If they need us to reach out to family with their permission, we're able to do that to help them set up support and manage how they are going to stay active in the community and make sure that they're socializing still and doing the things that are important to them. If that person that passed the clinical moves on to the road and then they do well on their road test, then we're recommending that they resume driving. Sometimes, if it's been a long time since they drove or there's a medical impairment, we suggest lessons. Lessons can be based with a local driving school if it's something that a certified driving instructor can help them with, or sometimes they need more specialized lessons, so it might have to be with a certified driver and rehab specialist, and that can be, a little bit more costly to them. And sometimes they fail on the road, and then we're having that retirement from driving discussion again. And some of our clients that come through us are looking for adaptive equipment. So that would be, a left pedal accelerator for either an amputee or a stroke patient, hand controls for a spinal cord. So then there's recommendations and training for that population.
All right, and thank you, Amy. We did invite Amy to be with us live today, but she had patience. So really appreciate you, Joanna, doing that interview with Amy so that we can share that information about the driver evaluations, which I think is really important information. So we have about 7 minutes left, which is terrific. We've heard a lot of great information. We've gotten a lot of really useful websites you've presented to us this morning. I do have a couple of questions from our audience that I want to put to all of you. So Michelle, this first one would be for you, and this is an audience member who would like to know, is there such a thing as a real ID for a non-driver ID card? What would a non-driver use for domestic air travel, for example?
Yes, that's a great question. And yes, the real ID is applicable to both a driver's license as well as a Massachusetts ID card. So it would require an in-person visit to the Registry of Motor Vehicles, and you would have to bring required documentation. We have all of that listed clearly on our website at mass.gov/ID. And so starting October 1st of this year, you will need to show TSA at the airport or at a federal office building. You'd need to show security either a valid passport or a real ID. So if you have a valid passport, you don't need to have a real ID because they will accept either one.
Okay, terrific. And you should have Michelle's email address too. So if you have further questions, this is for our audience member. If you have further questions, feel free to reach out to Michelle, and she is the expert on all things real ID for sure. Many presentations on that. So Rachel, I'm interested in something that one of our audience members has asked about, and that is the whole travel trainer concept that you talked about. That's pretty fascinating. how many communities have travel trainers available? Do they ever travel to another community? And in other words, they're teaching you how to ride a bus if you've never ridden a bus, or maybe you've never taken the T. Is that the idea?
Yeah, that's exactly the idea. So I would say about half, maybe 2/3 of the transit authorities in Massachusetts have a travel trainer on staff. Some have a full-time travel trainer, some have a part-time travel trainer. But in addition to those travel trainers that are available through transit authorities, which you can find a link to on my public transit webpage, the contact information for all those transit authorities that do have travel trainers. But in addition to that, human service agencies sometimes offer travel training as well. So I work with quite a few people who work in disability services, for example, who are helping people with disabilities learn how to get jobs and commute to work as part of that. And so one piece of that they'll do is they'll do some travel training. And that could be true for aging services as well. I know one ASAP that included travel training, and they actually incorporated falls prevention into their travel training program. So they were also helping people with the balance that they would need to safely ride the bus, as well as the skills and information and feeling confident in riding the bus.
Well, that's a terrific resource that I certainly wasn't aware of, so it makes a lot of sense. Joanna, I have a question for you from one of our viewers today. And he says, I think it was harder for my dad to give up driving than for my mother. Is this generally true? Do you generally find that it's more difficult perhaps for the man in the family who's traditionally done perhaps most or a lot of the driving to give up those keys?
Sure. Well, I'm not sure if there's research on that specifically. I can say personally, I've watched my grandmother and my grandfather go through that process as well. So my grandfather is the same age as my grandmother, but my grandmother made the decision quite early to stop driving because she noticed and she got into some little crashes. And so that was a really, she thought through it and said, I don't think I should be doing this anymore. My vision's just not the same. My abilities just aren't the same. So I'm going to take advantage of, like, her local church group comes and picks her up, pre-pandemic. That's what they were doing. So that worked out for her. But for my grandfather, he really has held on to driving. He drives from Florida to Rhode Island every single year. And
wow,
pretty firm on continuing to do that. And there have been some discussions, I think, there as well in a family way, saying, hey, we want to start helping you out with this, or at least talking about what the future for that transportation looks like. So I can say from personal experience, I would say that it does seem to be a little bit more difficult for maybe males who have kind of taken the lead in the family for driving, whereas for females, I know my grandmother, she didn't do much driving, so that's just the way I think it worked out in my family, but I bet that can be echoed in others as well.
Well, I think it was 11 degrees, or it felt like 11 degrees in Rhode Island this morning. So your grandfather had serious motivation to drive to Florida. It's a lot warmer there. Well, you know what? This has been really a great and enlightening conversation for me, and I think for all of our audience members this morning. So many great resources that I was not aware of that I now am aware of, and I hope our audience feels the same. You see our key timing website on your screen, and I just want to say to all of you, I think you agree with me that the important thing is to start the conversation, have the conversation, do the planning. You don't want to be in the position that I was in when I was driving 60 miles an hour with my dad on the Beltway to make that decision about driving retirement. So that concludes our time together this morning. For more information on AAA's key timing, you can visit AAA.com/key timing. We've given you the Mass Mobility website as well as the RMV sites, so please visit those for more information. We hope the resources we've outlined today will help you make good decisions about safety for yourself and for your loved ones. A big thank you to Mark Shieldrop, as always, for his terrific slides. Mark, you add so much to the presentation. And an even bigger thank you to our speakers and our audience today. Drive safely, buckle up. Thanks again for watching. For AAA Northeast, I'm Mary McGuire. Have a great day.